Hi, it's me, the storyteller. Thank you for joining me. Most of my stories on this channel are based on actual events, and some aren't. I'll let you decide if these stories are fiction, or if they're not. There are places on the map where no one goes, not because they're forbidden, but because the silence around them has never been broken. Selwyn Lake was one of those places. Mark Leland had been obsessed with it long before the expedition began. Selwyn sat on the edge of nowhere, straddling the border of Saskatchewan in the Northwest Territories, surrounded by boreal forest and reachable only by floatplane. No permanent structures, no road access, no recorded fishing trips, despite its size. It appeared in satellite imagery like a forgotten fingerprint pressed into the spine of the continent, rimmed by dense pine and the quiet threat of isolation. The film crew arrived on a Tuesday evening in early September, with the sky bruised and low. The float plane dropped them at the southern inlet, its engine fading into the distance as if reluctant to linger. There were only 3 of them. Mark, a wilderness documentarian known for chasing what others dismissed. Omar Reyes, a pragmatic biologist brought along to lend scientific credibility. And Tasha Kim, their sound engineer, whose quiet focus often made her seem like a satellite of her own. The lake greeted them with perfect stillness. The water lay flat and dark, disturbed only by the plane's wake as it retreated. The air smelled of wet pine and something older, earthbound and preserved. No birds called, no insects stirred. The trees stood motionless, thick and unbending. They set up camp on a gentle rise above the shoreline and spent the first 2 days filming scenery, exploring tree lines, and casting lines into empty water. The fish, like everything else, stayed hidden. It was the 3rd day when they found the footprints. Near the northeastern finger of the lake, where the spruce forest thinned and the soil turned soft with moss and peat, a trail of impressions appeared in a perfectly straight line. Each print was deep, bare, and unmistakably human-shaped, but grossly oversized. Over 15 inches long, with clearly defined toes and a wide arch. The trail crossed a half-rotted black spruce that had fallen across the forest floor, nearly 7 feet in diameter. The prints did not step onto the log or move around it. They simply continued, one before, one after, suggesting that whatever made them had cleared it in a single stride. The moss was torn, but not scattered. The weight distribution in each step was consistent. There were no claw marks, no dragging. Omar had theories about bears, about double prints, about misidentification, but none held up to measurement. The stride length alone, nearly 4.5 feet, defied logic. It was neither hoax nor mistake. Something large had passed through there, something upright. Tasha remained quiet as they studied the trail. She set up her field microphones that evening with a steady efficiency, placing 2 omnidirectional mics on tripods just beyond the clearing. She calibrated their sensitivity and left them powered on through the night, hoping to catch ambient noise, maybe distant wildlife, maybe something else. By the next morning, day 4, Tasha was gone. Her tent remained zipped, her boots neatly inside, her parka too untouched. One of the microphones had been knocked over, its casing cracked and half buried in soft earth. The other was missing altogether. The men searched for hours. The shoreline, the shallow woods, the boggy perimeter of the inlet. Her name echoed into the trees, but nothing came back. The air remained heavy and still, as if sound itself had been swallowed. That night, they sat by the fire with their backs to each other. Around midnight, the silence broke. first by a low, pulsing whoop far out beyond the tree line. It rose in pitch, then dropped abruptly, like a long exhale through a hollow throat. The sound had weight. It vibrated the air in their lungs and the soil beneath their boots. Then came silence again, thicker now, as if in anticipation. The following morning, day 5, they searched again. Slower this time. There was no sign of struggle, no hint of a trail. But they noticed something new, a scent that hadn't been there before. Musky and sharp, like wet dog and decaying cedar. It clung to the underbrush near the perimeter of camp and vanished just as quickly as it arrived. By late afternoon, with the sky beginning to churn overhead, they triggered the emergency beacon. The float plane arrived the next morning, Sunday, day 6. The pilot, an older man with eyes that didn't linger, said little as he loaded the gear. When asked about the area, he avoided the question with practiced silence. His posture changed subtly when they mentioned the footprints, the recordings, and Tasha's disappearance. He did not ask what they had seen. He did not ask if they were sure. But his unease settled in the space between his words. It was the kind of quiet that came from experience, not ignorance. They returned to the States, shaken and incomplete. Tasha's family did not accept her disappearance as final. They paid for multiple search teams. Float planes came and went. Cadaver dogs were flown in. Sonar was used to sweep the lake's edges. The surrounding forest was mapped, sectioned, and combed. But nothing was ever found. Not a jacket, not a footprint, not even the missing microphone. The lake kept its secret. The only thing left behind was a corrupted audio recorder, its card cracked and unreadable, and a set of still photographs showing the footprints they had discovered on day 3. No video was ever recovered. No camera had caught what the trees had taken. But on some nights, long after, Mark swore he could remember the sound that woke him, the low rhythm of something breathing just outside the circle of firelight, not moving, not calling, just listening, waiting. It was more than just a cabin. It had been in the family for 3 generations, built by his grandfather, kept alive by his father, and now trusted to Caleb. Tucked deep in the Colorado backcountry, the structure sat 2 hours from any paved road and 10 minutes past the last marker on the Forest Service map. No neighbors, no service, just woods and sky and time. He drove up every summer to keep it from falling into ruin. Fix the porch, check the roof, clear the chimney. He stayed alone most trips, but this time he brought Winston, his dog, a stocky, loyal mutt who never barked at nonsense and hated being indoors. The first few days passed like they always did. Caleb chopped wood, fixed a leaky pipe, and swept out the corners. Winston sniffed every tree within a 100-yard radius. At night, they sat on the porch under black skies, the trees whispering to each other in the wind. The silence was comforting, ancient. But by the 3rd night, that silence had changed. It wasn't just quiet. It was vacant, the kind of hush that pulls everything inward, like the woods themselves had pulled a blanket over their mouth. No crickets. No owls, no wind, just Winston sitting stiff at the foot of the bed, ears forward, locked on the rear wall of the cabin. Caleb listened. A long minute passed. Then Winston growled, low and steady. The sound of certainty, not confusion. He stepped to the back window, lifted the curtain, saw nothing. But in the darkness beyond the tree line, there came the sound of wood striking wood, a sharp, heavy knock. Then silence. His pulse thudded in his throat. He backed away, trying to explain it. Maybe a fallen branch, maybe an elk brushing a dead limb. He didn't believe a word of it. The next day, Winston stayed near the porch, ears twitching. Even the birds felt muted. That evening, Caleb secured the doors, loaded the rifle, and left a lantern burning in the front window. At 2:17 a.m., something hit the back wall. A massive, shuddering thud rattled the windows. Winston exploded into barking, teeth bared, fur rigid. Caleb was already moving, rifle in hand, heart hammering. He yanked the curtain back again. Nothing. Just a darkness too thick to trust. He cracked open the front door, letting lantern lights spill onto the ground. There were no prints, no rustling, but something had been there. For the next hour, Winston stood facing the back of the cabin, body tense. Caleb didn't sleep. He sat in the rocking chair, rifle across his lap, staring out at the window like it might blink. The following afternoon, Caleb circled the cabin. 20 yards out, he found a pine tree with a long, diagonal scrape across its bark, 7 feet high, stripped clean. No claw marks, no reason. That night, the forest returned to stillness, and then, without warning, came footsteps. Slow, deliberate, heavy. They crunched over gravel and circled the cabin, too heavy for any deer, too calculated for any bear. Then came the breath, a single huff, right outside the window. The glass fogged briefly. Winston let out a whine and slid beneath the bed. Caleb froze in place. He could feel it, the presence pressing against the wall. Not pounding, just leaning, like it was testing the structure, testing him. The wall creaked, and then it was gone. The next morning, Caleb packed without a word. He didn't eat, didn't clean. He loaded Winston into the truck and drove until the trees fell away and the cell signal returned. He didn't speak to anyone for 2 days. When his father finally called to check in, Caleb hesitated before sharing what had happened. He described the sounds, the feeling, the weight of being watched. There was a pause on the other end. Then his father said, "That happened to me once. Your grandfather, too." Caleb hasn't gone back since. Winston still perks up when they pass deep woods, still growls at empty windows when the wind dies. And some nights, Caleb dreams of standing in that cabin again, rifle in hand, walls breathing, something massive just outside. They had driven in before dawn, drawn to the marshlands near Plum Creek, flat, low country, surrounded by thick woods and old railroad crossings. A father and his 12-year-old son stepped from the truck bed, their dog bounding ahead through tall vegetation, still damp with dew. By mid-morning, just before noon, they reached a basin where the creek widened and the sky opened above black water. Tall wetland grasses brushed their jeans as they picked their way forward. The dog darted in and out of the reeds, tail flicking, nose buried. 4 railroad bridges stood behind them like hushed monuments. Across the glinting water, they spotted movement, what they assumed was a bedded deer shifting under the brush. Then came the crack. Something heavy landed hard just beyond the creek bank. Not a branch falling, not wind. A solid, full-body thud. A shape dropped from a tree. Dense, dark, hunched low. Black fur shimmered under a shaft of light. The dog bolted, barking wildly. The thing moved fast, not toward the dog, but toward them. A forward charge, all muscle and speed. The boy froze. The father pulled him close. Time split into pieces. The creature turned and vanished into the undergrowth, crashing through it with disturbing ease. Their dog chased it, bounding over brush, slipping up the embankment, leaping across the narrow gravel strip where the old rail line ran. They followed at a stumble, voices raw from shouting. The woods swallowed the echoes. The thing was already gone. They didn't linger. The father and son moved quickly back through the grassland, nerves snapping like downed wires. Something behind them shifted. A branch, maybe, or something heavier. They didn't look back, only ran. The entire encounter had lasted less than 10 seconds. Back at the truck, the world felt hollowed out. No birds, no bugs, just the ragged sound of the dog panting and the boy's voice, cracking as he tried to put shape to what he'd seen. A hulking form, upright but hunched, muscular, covered in thick dark hair. Not a bear, taller than a man. No snout, no paws. Something bipedal and fast. By evening, they submitted a report to the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization. Within days, investigator Matt Moneymaker contacted them. He found them credible, grounded, the kind of people who knew what a bear looked like and knew that this wasn't one. The dog's alarm, the burst of motion through the reeds, the vivid description, particularly the mention of a hairy back and big butt cheeks, as the father put it, all suggested an upright primate moving through the marsh. No photos, no video, but the memory was vivid and shared. No one wavered. In the days that followed, the marsh stayed quiet. No new reports, no strange tracks. The path they'd crossed grew back over. The deer beds reformed along the brush line. Everything looked unchanged, but for the boy and his father, the woods no longer felt like the same place. Something had bent the border that day, blurred it. There was the world you thought you knew, and then there was the flash of something else behind it. A flicker just long enough to make you question everything solid. They kept going outdoors, but never to that creek, never back to those tracks. And whenever they walked the edge of a clearing, they listened harder than they used to. Not for animals or hunters or storms, but for silence. Because silence, they now understood, was not the absence of noise. It was a pause, a signal, the way the woods brace themselves before something steps through. Toby Hanna, Pennsylvania is one of those in-between places, not rural enough to feel untouched, not urban enough to feel safe. Patches of new development interrupt swaths of thick greenbelt, and the woods behind every house seem deeper than they should be. Adam Keller hadn't been back in years. His childhood home had long since been sold, but his uncle's property still sat tucked at the end of an old gravel road, pressed up against protected forest land. The house was shuttered for winter, pipes drained, windows latched. But Adam had a long weekend and a key. He told himself he was going up to split wood and check for storm damage. Really, he was just looking for a place to get lost. The first day passed uneventfully. He swept out the dust, checked the gutters, started the generator to charge his phone and boil coffee. He walked the property line before dusk and listened to the creak of trees flexing in the cold. The silence was immediate and thick. There were no distant lawnmowers, no traffic drones, just forest, untamed and wide. By the second afternoon, Adam was hiking farther into the woods than he remembered going as a kid. The trails were less defined now, more suggestion than structure. Fallen trees blocked the old paths. Thick moss softened every footstep. He passed a long-forgotten stone wall, crumbling into the brush, then another, running parallel. Some old farmer's idea of order, now swallowed by green. It was past that second wall, in a low depression beneath a ridge where the air shifted. The quiet turned dense, not peaceful, but oppressive. The birds had vanished. Even the distant tapping of woodpeckers was gone. It was like walking into a soundproofed room in the middle of the forest. No wind, no insects, just the soft crunch of his boots against frostbitten leaves. And even that sounded wrong, as if muffled under heavy cloth. He paused to check his bearings, suddenly uncertain how far he'd come. The trees ahead grew in rigid lines, unnaturally uniform, all thin-trunked and pale like bone. The ground sloped gently but steadily, and the light had taken on a strange tint, gray-green and watery. The air smelled different here, not unpleasant, but strange. Damp earth mixed with mildew, touched with something faintly sour. A faint smell of something left too long in the dark. He considered turning back, but a pull, part curiosity, part instinct, urged him forward. Each step felt like stepping into thicker air, as if the forest itself resisted him. Then the trail abruptly vanished, swallowed by root clusters and hanging ferns. When he turned to retrace his steps, the path looked unfamiliar, less like something made by feet, more like something pushed through once, long ago. That's when he heard it. It started low, not a sound exactly, but a feeling. A slow, crushing hum that made his spine tighten and the hairs on his arms lift. Then, from deep within the trees, something roared. It was not an animal's cry. It wasn't wind or machinery. It was too big for the forest. The sound surged upward, deep and resonant, until it became a deafening scream. One that didn't echo, but seemed to press in from every direction, vibrating through his chest like a passing train. And just as suddenly as it started, it stopped, cut off in the middle of its own breath, as if something enormous had snapped its mouth shut. The stillness that followed was unbearable. He stood frozen, eyes locked on the trees ahead, expecting motion, expecting anything, but nothing moved. Not a branch, not a bird. It was like the world had held its breath and hadn't decided whether to exhale. When he could move again, he didn't think. He just turned and ran. His boots skidded across wet stone. Thorns scraped his arms, and the forest felt tighter with every step. The deeper quiet seemed to follow him, curling around his shoulders like invisible arms. He stumbled once and caught himself on a moss-slick boulder, palms stinging from the cold. It was nearly dark by the time he reached the house. The last of the sun lit the roofline like an ember. He shut the door hard and locked it without even realizing his hand had moved. The silence came with him. That night, the generator sputtered and cut out. He sat in the living room by a lantern light, wrapped in his coat, not reading, not moving, just listening. Around 2 a.m., he heard it again. Not the roar, not the hum, just one sound. A single footstep, heavy and deliberate, pressed into the gravel just outside the side window. Not pacing, not circling, just a presence, placing itself where he could hear it. He didn't sleep after that. When dawn came, pale and slow, he packed what he could and left everything else behind. No breakfast, no cleanup. He was on the road before the frost melted. No one else reported anything unusual in Tobyhanna that week. No power surges, no missing pets, no unexplained noises. Just another cold snap and the forest closing in. Later, when asked, Adam struggled to describe what he heard. He used words like mechanical, throaty, and too close. He said it sounded like something trying not to be noticed, but failing in the loudest possible way. He never went back to his uncle's cabin, and whatever made that sound never showed itself. It didn't have to. being heard was enough. If you enjoyed these stories, please consider subscribing to the channel. Give it a like, a comment, and maybe a share. But if you didn't like the stories, maybe share it with someone you don't like. In any case, I'm glad you stuck around to the end.